There is a specific kind of quiet that descends upon a room not when an argument is won, but when the very desire to win it evaporates into thin air. For years, we have been conditioned to believe that silence during a conflict is a sign of defeat, a white flag waved by someone who has run out of arguments, or a mature concession born from mutual understanding. We tell ourselves comforting lies about agreeing to disagree, wrapping ourselves in the warm illusion that time and patience will eventually bridge the chasm between two stubborn minds. But let us strip away the polite fiction and look at the raw, jagged truth that nobody wants to admit out loud. When someone suddenly stops explaining themselves, stops correcting your skewed versions of events, and stops fighting for their side of the story, it is rarely because they have finally seen your perspective. More often than not, it is because they have looked deep into the machinery of your stubbornness and realized that maintaining the relationship requires a continuous sacrifice of their own sanity. They haven't found peace. They have simply surrendered the battlefield because they've finally calculated the cost of your enlightenment and found you utterly bankrupt. Think about the exhausting cycles you have endured in your own life, the endless loops of rehashing the exact same grievances over plates that grow cold and nights that bleed into dawn. You sit across from someone, a partner, a parent, a lifelong friend, and you say the same words you said 6 months ago and 6 years before that. You trace the contours of your pain with meticulous care, providing evidence, context, and emotional blueprints, hoping that this time, just this once, the light bulb will flicker on behind their eyes. You watch their face for that micro-expression of sudden comprehension, the softening of the jaw, the slight nod that says, "I see you now." Instead, you get deflection, counter-accusations, or a stubborn doubling down on a narrative that serves their ego better than the truth. And yet, you keep trying. You believe that persistence is a virtue, that love means never giving up on someone, and that if you just phrase it differently, use a softer tone, or cry harder, the wall will finally crumble. That is the great delusion we feed ourselves, the belief that everyone possesses the capacity to outgrow their own defensiveness if we just love them hard enough. The breaking point never arrives with a dramatic explosion, a shattered vase, or a slammed door. Those belong to the amateur theatricals of early conflict, where both parties still care enough to make a scene, still believe that their anger holds enough weight to command a reaction. The true end of a dynamic comes in a whisper, in the middle of a sentence where you suddenly hear the sheer futility of your own voice. You realize in a flash of cold clarity that you are performing a play for an audience of one who refuses to read the script. Every minute spent defending your intentions is a minute wasted on someone whose primary goal is not to understand you, but to win. You begin to notice the terrifying predictability of their defenses, like clockwork gears grinding out the same tired excuses. You see the patterns so clearly that you can mouth their next sentence before it forms on their lips. And in that precise moment, a profound, hollow exhaustion sets in. It is not anger anymore. Anger is warm and energetic. This is cold, heavy, unyielding detachment. You realize that continuing to explain yourself is like trying to fill a bucket with a hole at the bottom, and you simply decide to let go of the handle. People mistake this sudden cessation of hostilities for maturity, patting themselves on the back for keeping the peace and avoiding a fight. How arrogant of us to assume that quietness equals harmony. When you stop fighting back, it is because you have quietly demoted the other person from a partner in dialogue to a permanent fixture of disappointment. You stop correcting their mischaracterizations of your past actions because you realize that their version of you is designed to protect their own fragile ego, and no amount of historical evidence will ever pierce that armor. You let them win the argument by default, not because their logic is sound, but because you no longer care enough about their opinion of you to correct it. That is the quiet tragedy of modern relationships. We do not drift apart because we stop loving each other. We drift apart because one person gets tired of holding the entire emotional weight of mutual understanding alone and simply lets go. Consider the energy it takes to maintain hope in the face of repeated, predictable disappointment. Every time you open up, you are handing someone a weapon with the naive expectation that they will choose to admire it rather than use it against you. After the 100th time, they aim it right at your most tender insecurities during a minor disagreement. Something inside you permanently recalibrates. You stop offering them your vulnerabilities. You keep your stories brief, your answers vague, and your emotional investments strictly rationed. You become polite, agreeable, and entirely unreachable. To an outside observer, you look like you are getting along swimmingly. You share meals, you exchange pleasantries, you occupy the same physical space without a raised voice. But beneath that veneer of domestic tranquility lies a vast, unbridgeable wasteland of emotional abandonment. You are living with a ghost of someone you used to try to reach, cohabiting with a stranger whose mind you have permanently stopped trying to decode because the lock was broken from the inside. We are terrified of this realization because it forces us to confront the limits of empathy. We want to believe that love can cure blindness, that patience can cure stubbornness, and that given enough time, every human being will eventually choose growth over comfort. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. Some people are fundamentally invested in misunderstanding you because understanding you would require them to take accountability for the damage they have caused. To admit you are right is to admit they were wrong, and for many, that ego fracture is too terrifying to contemplate. Once you internalize this reality, the urge to argue vanishes entirely. You look at them across the table, spinning their familiar narratives, twisting facts to fit their preferred storyline, and instead of the old familiar surge of frustration, you feel nothing. A strange, liberating numbness. You nod, you murmur a non-committal agreement, and you change the subject to the weather or the groceries. You have given them what they always wanted, the last word. But you have also quietly packed your bags and checked out of the relationship while keeping your mailing address the same. This is why silence is the loudest verdict a human being can deliver. It is the sound of a heart locking its doors, pulling down the heavy iron shutters, and turning off all the lights from the inside. You can scream at a wall, you can beat your fists against it, you can paint it in bright colors or curse it for blocking your view, but the wall does not change. It remains what it is, dense, unmoving, and entirely indifferent. Eventually, any sane person stops shouting at the brick and simply walks around it, or stops walking that path altogether. When you stop arguing, it is not because you have found common ground. It is because you have finally accepted that the ground beneath you is quicksand, and every word you spend trying to establish a footing only pulls you deeper into the mire. You save your breath for breathing, your energy for things that grow, and your love for places where it is received as a gift rather than an obligation. The greatest betrayal in any connection is not a sudden, explosive blow, but the slow, agonizing death of hope that happens in the quiet spaces where nobody is yelling anymore. Silence isn't the peace after a storm, it's the cemetery of a dying bond. You didn't stop arguing because you understand each other, you stopped because you gave up.